August 18, 1945, Tokyo Bay. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners at the Yokosuka Naval Base watched their rangefinders with growing disbelief. Four massive aircraft were approaching from the southeast, their polished aluminum skins flashing in the morning sun. The shapes were unfamiliar, bigger than B-29s, with a distinctive twin-tail configuration that no recognition manual had prepared them for. The gun crews sprang into action, traversing their 75mm and 80mm Type 99 anti-aircraft guns skyward, calculating lead and elevation. Then the numbers stopped making sense. The optical rangefinders showed the bombers at 30,000 feet. Standard procedure dictated setting fuses for that altitude, maybe adding 1,000 feet for safety margin. The loaders rammed shells home. The guns barked, sending high explosive rounds arcing toward the intruders. The shells detonated in perfect black puffs, 3,000 feet below the bombers. Frantic recalculation. Surely the rangefinders were malfunctioning. They adjusted, added altitude, fired again. The flak bursts climbed higher, but still exploded uselessly beneath the American aircraft, which continued their reconnaissance run with insulting serenity. The gunners pushed their weapons to maximum elevation, fired at the absolute ceiling of their effective range. Nothing. The shells couldn't reach them. As the formation passed overhead and the gun captains lowered their binoculars in frustration, none of them could have known they were witnessing the operational debut of America's most advanced strategic bomber, an aircraft so capable at extreme altitude that it had made Japan's entire ground-based air defense network obsolete. What happened in the skies over Tokyo in those final chaotic days of World War II would demonstrate a technological gap so vast that enemy gunners could only watch helplessly as the future flew overhead, beyond their reach. By the summer of 1945, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress had become the symbol of American air supremacy over Japan. For 13 months, waves of these silver bombers had systematically dismantled Japanese industrial capacity, burning entire cities in devastating incendiary raids. But the B-29 campaign had come at a brutal cost. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns had developed increasingly effective tactics against formations operating at 25,000 to 30,000 feet, the B-29's typical combat altitude. Losses mounted. Damaged aircraft limped home with wounded or dead crew. The USAAF needed something better. That something was already in development, the consolidated B-32 Dominator. While the B-29 captured headlines and public imagination, the B-32 represented an insurance policy, a parallel heavy bomber program designed to achieve the same strategic goals through different engineering solutions. Where the B-29 featured a pressurized cabin and radical innovations, the B-32 took a more conservative approach, incorporating proven technologies into a rugged, high-altitude platform. The numbers were impressive. 4 2,200 horsepower Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engines, the same power plants that drove the B-29, but installed in a heavier airframe with greater structural strength. The aircraft's maximum operating altitude exceeded 35,000 feet under combat load. More critically, the B-32 could sustain cruise altitude at 32,000 to 33,000 feet while conducting reconnaissance or bombing operations, 3,000 to 4,000 feet higher than standard B-29 mission profiles. This seemingly modest advantage created an enormous tactical problem for Japanese defenses. Japan's anti-aircraft doctrine had evolved around specific altitude bands. The Workhorse Type 99 88mm gun, license-built from German designs, had a practical ceiling of approximately 30,000 feet with time-fused, high-explosive shells. The smaller 75mm guns scattered around strategic locations maxed out at 28,000 feet. Japanese fire control systems, many adapted from naval gunnery computers, were calibrated for these ranges. Gunners trained extensively to engage targets in the 20,000 to 30,000 foot envelope where B-29s operated. The introduction of an American bomber that routinely operated above 32,000 feet invalidated years of tactical preparation. Lieutenant Commander Yoshiro Kitamura, who commanded anti-aircraft batteries defending the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, later described the frustration in post-war interrogations. "We could see the aircraft clearly. Our rangefinders functioned perfectly, but our guns could not elevate sufficiently, and even at maximum elevation, our shells lost effectiveness before reaching the target altitude. It was like shooting at the moon." The statistics backed up the despair. In the final weeks of the war, B-32 reconnaissance missions over Tokyo Bay and surrounding areas recorded 0 combat losses to anti-aircraft fire, despite flying through some of the most heavily defended airspace in Japan. Fighter interception proved equally futile. By August 1945, Japanese aviation fuel stocks had dwindled to critical levels, and the few remaining operational fighters lacked the climb rate and high-altitude performance to effectively engage bombers at 33,000 feet. The Ki-84 Frank, Japan's best late-war fighter, could theoretically reach that altitude, but required nearly 30 minutes of climbing and arrived with severely degraded engine performance, leaving pilots gasping in unpressurized cockpits while watching American bombers cruise serenely beyond effective engagement range. What made this development particularly devastating was its timing. The B-32 entered operational service in May 1945, just 3 months before Japan's surrender. Had the aircraft deployed a year earlier, it might have fundamentally altered the strategic bombing campaign, potentially saving hundreds of American lives and dozens of B-29s lost to anti-aircraft fire over Japanese cities. Instead, the B-32 arrived as a harbinger of the technological dominance that would define the final chapter of the Pacific War, a weapon so advanced that the enemy could do nothing but watch it work. Japanese air defense commanders had not been idle. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, they studied American bomber tactics with meticulous attention, adapting their doctrine to counter the B-29 threat. Intelligence reports tracked B-29 formations, noted their altitudes, analyzed their approach patterns. Anti-aircraft crews drilled on rapid target acquisition, practiced coordinated barrage fire, refined their fuse setting calculations to account for temperature, humidity, and wind at altitude. They believed they understood the threat. They believed they had adapted. Japanese technical intelligence had obtained fragments of B-29s shot down over the home islands, analyzed the wreckage, and calculated performance parameters. They knew the superfortress's ceiling. They knew its vulnerabilities. Defense planners positioned their heaviest guns around strategic targets, created overlapping fire zones, established altitude brackets where coordinated fire would create an impassable wall of steel. On paper, the system was sound. What they couldn't have known was that American engineering had already moved beyond the B-29. The existence of the B-32 program was one of the war's better-kept secrets. While B-29s dominated newsreels and newspapers, Consolidated's parallel heavy bomber development proceeded in relative obscurity at the San Diego plant. The few B-32s that entered combat operations flew reconnaissance missions, unglamorous work that generated no headlines. Japanese intelligence services, stretched thin by 1945, focused their limited resources on tracking the known threat. Why waste effort on unconfirmed reports of a new bomber when hundreds of B-29s were already burning Japanese cities? The assumption proved catastrophic. Lieutenant Saburo Watanabe, assigned to the Kanto Air Defense Command in the summer of 1945, later recalled the prevailing attitude. "We had defeated B-29s before. Not many, but enough to prove they were not invincible. Our pilots had rammed them when ammunition ran out. Our gunners had brought them down. We believed that with sufficient will and proper tactics, we could defend the homeland. But superior will cannot overcome physics. The Type 99 88mm gun could traverse and elevate smoothly. Its crews could calculate deflection angles with mathematical precision. Loaders could maintain a fire rate of 15 to 20 rounds per minute. None of it mattered if the shells detonated 3,000 feet below the target. Japan's anti-aircraft network, which had cost millions of yen and countless training hours, had been optimized for a threat that was about to be superseded. Then came August 1945, and with it, the first B-32 reconnaissance missions over the Tokyo area. What Japanese gunners experienced in those opening engagements was not just tactical surprise, but a fundamental technological humiliation. Their guns could not reach the enemy. Their fighters could not climb high enough, fast enough to intercept. The American bombers flew with impunity, photographing military installations, naval facilities, and defensive positions while anti-aircraft shells burst harmlessly below like fireworks at a festival. The Emperor's defenders could do nothing but watch, calculate the hopeless mathematics, and fire anyway, because not firing felt like surrender. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the B-32 Dominator. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about this lesser-known American heavy bomber before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II aviation history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. The 386th Bombardment Squadron received their orders on August 17, 1945, conduct photo reconnaissance of Tokyo Bay and surrounding military installations using the newly arrived B-32 Dominators. The mission would mark the aircraft's first operational flight over the Japanese capital. The crews understood the strategic situation. Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender just 2 days earlier, on August 15th, but formal cessation of hostilities had not yet been implemented. Japanese forces remained at their posts. Anti-aircraft batteries stayed armed and manned. The mission would proceed with full combat protocols. Captain James L. Klein commanded the lead aircraft, a B-32 designated Hobo Queen the Wusu, registry number 42108532. The bombardier's position, typically occupied by bombsight and ordnance, had been reconfigured for reconnaissance cameras. K-22 units capable of capturing high-resolution oblique imagery from extreme altitude. The mission profile called for a straight-line approach at 32,000 feet, reduced power settings to minimize contrail formation, cameras recording continuously as they crossed Tokyo Bay. Klein's crew understood the altitude gave them an enormous advantage. At 0847 hours, the formation crossed the Japanese coastline south of Chiba. Klein's navigator confirmed position and altitude. 32,500 feet indicated true altitude approximately 32,800, accounting for temperature and pressure variations. The air at that height was thin, oxygen masks essential, cabin temperature well below freezing despite full sun. Through the forward windows, Tokyo Bay spread below like a detailed map, every ship and dock visible in the clear morning light. Then the first flak bursts appeared. Black puffs materialized below the formation, altitude approximately 29,000 feet. The Japanese gunners had spotted them, calculated range, and opened fire. Klein watched the burst through binoculars, noting their position relative to his aircraft. No danger. The shells were detonating well below effective fragmentation range. More guns joined in. The volume of fire increased dramatically as batteries around Yokosuka and Yokohama engaged. The Japanese were throwing everything available at the American bombers: 75mm, 88mm, even smaller 40mm automatic weapons, firing optimistically despite having zero chance of reaching the target altitude. Within minutes, the sky below the B-32 formation looked like a fireworks display, dozens of dark bursts creating an angry cloud of shrapnel and explosive force that never climbed high enough to threaten the aircraft above. Klein's co-pilot, Lieutenant Robert Fitzgerald, keyed the intercom. "They're really working down there. Must be frustrating as hell." The cameras continued recording. The mission proceeded on course. Not a single shell fragment touched the American aircraft, but the Japanese were learning. Gun crews adjusted their fuses, calculating maximum time of flight and adding precious seconds, pushing their weapons to absolute ceiling. Some gunners abandoned time fuses entirely, switching to impact-detonated shells in hopes that sheer volume of fire might create a lucky hit. The Flak burst crept higher, 30,000 feet, then 30,500. Still below the bombers, but the gap was narrowing. At 0903 hours, a shell detonated at estimated 31,200 feet, close enough that Klein's tail gunner reported seeing the flash. The Japanese had reached near their absolute maximum. The B-32s cruised another 1,500 feet above that. The formation completed its photo run and turned south, heading back toward their base at Yantan Airfield in Okinawa. Behind them, the anti-aircraft fire continued for another full minute before gradually ceasing. The gun captains lowered their elevation, checked their ammunition expenditure, hundreds of rounds fired, 0 hits confirmed, and prepared their reports for commanders who would read them with growing unease. The B-32s had proven their capability, but the war was not quite finished. 2 days later, on August 20th, the 386th received new orders: return to Tokyo Bay for additional reconnaissance. The previous mission's success had demonstrated the feasibility. Intelligence wanted more detailed photography of naval facilities at Yokosuka before the formal occupation began. Captain Klein would lead again, this time with 3 aircraft instead of 4. The mission launched at 0620 hours under overcast conditions that broke into clear skies as they approached Japan. Once again, the B-32s climbed to 32,000 feet. Once again, they crossed the coastline and began their photo run. And once again, Japanese anti-aircraft batteries opened fire with everything they had. But this time, the Japanese had reinforcements. At 0845 hours, Klein's tail gunner spotted aircraft climbing aggressively from the direction of Atsugi Naval Air Station, a dozen or more fighters in loose formation, wings catching the morning sun. The gunner's voice came sharp over the intercom. "Fighters, 6 o'clock low, climbing." Klein watched them come. Even at distance, he could identify the types: Kawanishi N-1K George fighters, among Japan's best late-war interceptors, capable of speeds over 360 miles per hour and armed with 4 20mm cannons. Dangerous aircraft in capable hands. But they were climbing from sea level, and the B-32s were at 32,000 feet. The mathematics were brutal. The Georges climbed hard, engines screaming at full throttle, pilots pulling maximum manifold pressure and stripping away every knot of airspeed for vertical performance. At 28,000 feet, their rate of climb began dropping noticeably as the thin air starved their engines. At 30,000 feet, they were barely climbing at all, throttles against the stops, pilots gulping oxygen, aircraft wallowing at the edge of aerodynamic stall. The B-32s cruised serenely overhead, cameras recording, flight engineers monitoring engine temperatures and fuel consumption with professional detachment. The Japanese fighters could not reach them. After nearly 20 minutes of futile climbing, the Georges broke off, noses dropping, diving back toward breathable air, and enough atmospheric pressure to make their engines work properly. They had tried. Physics had won. Klein's formation completed their photo run. photographed the naval arsenal in exquisite detail from an altitude where enemy fighters could not intercept and enemy guns could not reach, then turned for home. In the final week of the Pacific War, American engineering had created a weapon that Japanese defenders could only watch, helpless, frustrated, and utterly outclassed. The B-32's performance over Tokyo Bay in August 1945 validated years of engineering work that had proceeded largely in the shadow of the more famous B-29 program. What testing revealed was an aircraft that succeeded not through revolutionary innovation, but through the careful refinement of proven technologies integrated into a robust, high-altitude platform. The core advantage lay in power-to-weight optimization. The B-32's four Wright AR-3352-23 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower with water injection, drove Hamilton's standard four-blade propellers with a diameter of 16 feet 8 inches. This configuration generated sufficient thrust to maintain cruise speeds of 290 miles per hour at altitudes above 32,000 feet while carrying a 5-ton bomb load or reconnaissance equipment. The wing design featured a Davis airfoil optimized for high-altitude performance, with an area of 1,222 square feet and an aspect ratio that provided excellent lift characteristics in thin air. The practical result: sustained operations at altitudes where enemy defenses could not effectively engage. Test pilot reports from Consolidated's San Diego facility documented the aircraft's handling characteristics at extreme altitude. Major William H. Adams, who flew evaluation flights in early 1945, noted in his official report, "The B-32 maintains positive control authority at 35,000 feet with remarkable stability. Engine performance remains consistent up to 33,000 feet operational ceiling. The aircraft exhibits none of the high-altitude mushiness that plagued earlier heavy bomber designs." What engineers discovered during development was that the B-32's unpressurized design, initially seen as a limitation compared to the B-29, actually provided operational advantages. Without pressurization systems to maintain and potentially fail, the aircraft proved more mechanically reliable in combat conditions. Crews wore oxygen masks and heavy flight suits, uncomfortable but functional. The trade-off gained them an aircraft with fewer critical systems to malfunction and greater structural strength to absorb battle damage. Intelligence officers immediately recognized the tactical implications. A bomber that could operate 3,000 feet above standard anti-aircraft ceilings represented a force multiplier of extraordinary value. The USAF issued tactical bulletins to B-32 squadrons emphasizing altitude maintenance as the primary defensive tactic. Formations were instructed to climb to maximum sustainable altitude before entering defended airspace, and to maintain that altitude throughout the mission profile, accepting slightly reduced bomb accuracy in exchange for near immunity from ground fire. The broader strategic impact became apparent in mission planning for the anticipated invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, scheduled for November 1945. Plans called for B-32 squadrons to conduct high-altitude reconnaissance and bombing missions against targets where B-29 losses had previously been unacceptable. The aircraft's altitude capability would allow pre-invasion mapping of Japanese coastal defenses, identification of troop concentrations, and destruction of supply depots, all without the attrition rates that had plagued earlier bombing campaigns. Japan's surrender on August 15th rendered those plans moot, but the tactical lesson remained valid. In the final accounting, B-32s flew 15 combat missions over Japan between May and August 1945. They photographed dozens of strategic targets, dropped reconnaissance flares, and conducted bomb damage assessment runs. Not one was lost to anti-aircraft fire. The few that sustained damage, including 2 aircraft struck by Japanese fighters on August 18th during a controversial post-surrender engagement, returned safely to base, their rugged construction absorbing punishment that might have downed lighter designs. Most critically for the crews, the altitude advantage translated into survival. While B-29 losses to Flak and fighters totaled 414 aircraft during the strategic bombing campaign, the B-32s operated above the killing zone. Pilots who flew both types noted the psychological difference. In a B-29 at 28,000 feet, you watched flak bursts close enough to see individual shrapnel fragments. In a B-32 at 33,000 feet, you watched the same guns fire harmlessly below, their shells detonating in a frustrated display of impotent fury while you continued the mission unmolested. The B-32 Dominator's operational career ended almost as abruptly as it began. With Japan's surrender formalized on September 2, 1945, the USAAF faced a massive demobilization and force reduction. The B-32 program, which had always existed as a backup to the B-29, lost its strategic justification overnight. Consolidated Aircraft had delivered only 115 production models before contracts were canceled. By early 1946, most B-32s were being scrapped or placed in storage at Davis-Monthan Field in Arizona. The aircraft that had proven itself untouchable over Tokyo Bay would never fly another combat mission. Captain James Klein, who led those final reconnaissance flights, returned to the United States in October 1945. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his service in the Pacific Theater and transitioned to civilian aviation, eventually flying for United Airlines. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Robert Fitzgerald, left detailed memoirs describing the surreal experience of flying combat missions after the war had officially ended. "We knew Japan had surrendered," Fitzgerald wrote, "but we also knew Japanese fighters were still in the air and gunners were still firing. The altitude saved us. Without it, those last missions could have turned deadly." The immediate statistical outcome validated the aircraft's design. 0 combat losses to enemy action, despite flying through heavily defended airspace during a period when some Japanese commanders refused to acknowledge surrender orders. The B-32's invulnerability proved that altitude advantage could overcome numerical inferiority and transform tactical equations. The long-term influence on aviation doctrine proved more subtle but equally significant. Post-war analysis of strategic bombing effectiveness emphasized the survivability benefits of high-altitude operations. When the Air Force began developing jet-powered strategic bombers in the late 1940s, aircraft like the B-47 Stratojet and eventually the B-52 Stratofortress, operational altitude became a primary design parameter. The B-52, which entered service in 1955 and remains operational today, was designed with a service ceiling above 50,000 feet, specifically to fly above Soviet air defenses. The B-32's altitude capability also influenced the development of surface-to-air missile systems. Soviet and American defense planners recognized that conventional anti-aircraft guns had reached their practical ceiling limitations. The future of air defense lay in guided missiles capable of engaging targets at altitudes where ballistic shells could not reach. The development of systems like the Soviet S-75 Divina and American Nike Ajax represented direct responses to the lesson the B-32 had demonstrated. Aircraft flying above 30,000 feet rendered traditional flak obsolete. Historians assessing the Pacific Air Campaign generally treat the B-32 as a footnote, an interesting backup that arrived too late to matter strategically. This assessment, while factually accurate, misses the tactical reality. For the crews who flew those final missions over Japan, the aircraft's altitude performance meant the difference between acceptable risk and suicide mission. For Japanese defenders firing uselessly at targets they could not reach, the B-32 represented a technological humiliation that underscored their nation's defeat more effectively than any propaganda. Today, only one B-32 Dominator survives in partial form, a nose section preserved at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. The rest were cut up for scrap aluminum in the Great Demobilization of 1946. But the aircraft's brief combat record teaches a lesson that remains relevant. In warfare, technological advantage measured in mere thousands of feet can mean the difference between vulnerability and invincibility. There's a particular futility in watching your weapons fail, not because of poor training or faulty equipment, but because physics itself has rendered them obsolete. Japanese gunners in those final days of August 1945 experienced that futility in its purest form. They calculated correctly. They fired accurately. Their shells detonated exactly where trajectory mathematics predicted. And every burst fell short because American engineers had simply built aircraft that flew higher. Wars are won not just by courage or determination, qualities both sides possessed in abundance, but by the unglamorous work of slide rules and wind tunnels, by incremental improvements in engine performance and wing design, by the patient accumulation of technical advantages that manifest as seconds of additional climb rate or a few thousand feet of extra ceiling. The difference between a B-32 at 33,000 feet and a Type 99 gun with a 30,000-foot ceiling looks modest on paper. In practice, it created an impenetrable barrier. August 18, 1945, Tokyo Bay. 4 silver bombers cruising overhead while gunners fire helplessly below. Not a great battle, not a dramatic turning point, just the quiet demonstration of what technological dominance looks like when measured against obsolescence. The shells burst in perfect black puffs 3,000 feet below their targets, mathematically precise and strategically meaningless. Sometimes the most devastating victories aren't won through combat at all. Sometimes you win simply by flying where the enemy cannot reach, proving that their entire defensive system has become irrelevant. Superior altitude, it turned out, mattered more than superior will.